to call this workshop into session. Today is Monday, July 27th, and we are going to have a workshop on discussion of supporting elements of reentry, and Superintendent Cohort will present.
Good evening, everyone. I want to share with you tonight's presentation, but I want to preface it before we get started. To safely reopen our schools, we've been charged with numerous mandates or guidelines, if you will, from the state of Maine. These guidelines are the rules to which we can re-enter schools. And when we look at the size of our student enrollment, we will not be able to enter schools in full session in the fall and be in compliance with the law. So what we've been charged to do, and I want to thank the team of leaders in our district, from operations to teaching and learning, and our building principals and administrators. And I'll reach as far as saying teachers who have chimed in. We have a leadership group there as well, support staff, nurses, what have you. So this is a pretty comprehensive plan that's going on throughout the summer, or planning process that's going on throughout the summer. And I want to just reiterate to people that this plan wasn't a decision that was made local. This plan is in response to the mandates we have from the state of Maine to be compliant and open schools in a safe way. So you'll see things that have been released to us, but there is also numerous questions we don't have answered yet because of the guidelines that are still coming. And so we're doing our best to predict, prepare, and also respond to those as they become actively available. Some of the things that we're still working on or waiting for are more descriptive guidelines around things like transportation. It's still not fully available to us how many students we can put on a bus. Those guidelines will dictate other steps, and so again, we're still working with the guidelines we have while getting others. So the plans that we're going to share with you involve the limitations of the size of our enrollment, what we can't do because of the guidelines. And I want to be clear, as we look at this meeting tonight, and I don't know what people at home can see, there's some spacing that we have here. The spacing that the guidelines require from staff to student is 6 feet. So when we look at our classroom spacing, if you give 6 feet in any kind of radius, it limits the number of students you can put in that classroom. And we've had a number of conversations about, well, are there any unused classrooms or open classrooms? The answer is there may be some, but we don't have staff for those spaces. In addition to the complications of anything that we do to modify our schedule, whether the times of the day or the amount of kids that can be in the building, we have a real serious concern around the implications it will have for community members, their families, our staff, their families, and the kids of our district that we care greatly about. So we'll go through some of those limitations today, and we'll share with you, as required by the state, 2 different plans. A more detailed hybrid plan, and also remote learning. Those are the 2 charts that we have from DOE, and we'll do our best to articulate to you what we believe from our leadership group is a feasible plan given the guidelines that are required. I also want to share that there are things that you may see when you look online. There are guidelines and also safeguards. Safeguards are considered best practice, and if you can do them, you should. Guidelines are law. They're not negotiable. And so when we talk about students being 6 feet apart from each other, staff being 6 feet apart from each other, wearing masks in a school learning setting, certainly that will present challenges. So without further ado, I guess I would like to just kick off into the slideshow, introduce Assistant Superintendent Karen Paquette, who will be helping present this series of slides.
So I'm going to try to sit here instead of stand up in front of everybody, but I want to make sure people can hear me. So if I'm yelling, I'm sorry, but I want to make sure people can hear. I want to reiterate what Superintendent Langlis said about the teams that worked together on this. This was not a single effort. This was definitely a group effort, and it continues to be a group effort. I actually just left the district office and did a practice run with our teacher advisory group of this same presentation and got some feedback from them. My team in the Office of Teaching and Learning, Bobby's team, operations, our social emotional learning team, we all work together. And here's a explanation of who's on those teams. We were tasked by the state to have some reentry planning teams, and so based on that, that's what we've created here. And I think it's important to note that building administrators have created the same types of teams in their buildings to provide opportunities for teachers to work out some of the details in their own building, as well as provide us feedback at the district level. So principals and department heads and different programs have worked together to bring all that information here and hopefully have a plan that's going to at least get us started with this conversation. So here's our priorities for opening, again, based on the state framework. Number one for us is health and safety of students, teachers, staff, and families. As Superintendent Langley said, if we can't do something, if it's not going to be safe and healthy, then it's not an option. Second, the quality of educational experiences for all our learners. If it's not going to be good quality, then that's not a viable option either. And then the other three are important as well. Again, based on the main CDC guidelines and what this Department of Ed is putting out in terms of how we're going to determine which level we're at and what we're cleared to be able to do. July 31st seems to be the magic date, so we're waiting for Friday to hear which designation we are. You heard Superintendent Langley say that all in-person is probably a no-go. We don't have the space nor the staff to make that happen. So even if we were green, we would still be looking at a hybrid or remote learning option.
If I could, Karen, I just want to reiterate to people, when we are green, we are not all systems go in Lewiston Public Schools. Because of our enrollment, I know I'm repeating exactly what she just said, I think it's really important for people to hear. When we are green, we are hybrid at best, if that's what the school committee decides to do for a direction. We do not have the capacity to be in school in full.
Because and I think it's important to point out, we're still obligated to meet those safety guidelines. So unless the safety guidelines change dramatically, it just isn't a possibility for us at this point. I also want to reiterate before I go to this, something that is super important, and I'm really proud of us for this. Our teams have worked very closely with other districts around this region to come up with a plan that's similar across the region. So Auburn won't be doing something drastically different than Lewiston, or Oak Hill won't be doing something drastically different than Lewiston or Auburn. And I'm really proud of our region for working together, and I'm really proud of our district team for making those connections and continuously bringing those people in to have that conversation.
Sarah, can I ask a question?
Of course.
So was the previously established Superintendents Cohort, Western Maine, was that used for this purpose, or were they individual connections across like peer positions?
Both.
Okay.
Both. So the superintendent's group definitely, area high school principals, which Jake still goes to once in a while now. They were meeting this afternoon. They've had some conversations. And then Bobby has facilitated and connected us with Auburn on a regular basis, just so that the two districts can compare notes, because we're the larger districts of the region. So it was both.
Okay, thank you.
So as Jake said, we are looking at these guidelines, and these are some things that we pulled out that we wanted to highlight for today. So face coverings. All individuals in all buildings and all LPS transportation would need to be wearing a face covering. There is some, you've heard us talk about the CARES funds. There's also some additional funds. They're calling them COVID relief funds, and we can talk more about that. That's some additional funding from the state. that would allow us to buy additional supplies. So in our CARES funds, we've put that money in there. I'm sure our COVID relief funds budget will allow for us to provide us those. And the state has also, from a state level, provided us with the ability to place an order, a large order, that I think would cover us for a couple of months. Not a long time, but it's a couple of months. So shields available for those with a medical or other need. So shields are part of the order and part of the process, but they're not the first choice. Masks are definitely the first choice. Mask breaks, I think, are important to know that that's a requirement that we include mask breaks for students and for staff. And most of the suggestion is to take folks outside to do those mask breaks, to give them some space to be able to take their mask off and get some fresh air. So that will require some adjustments to our schedule to allow for that. Social distancing, Jake talked about 6 feet. There is a 3 feet, if it's feasible within a classroom, can be allowable within the confines of the classroom as long as teacher and students have masks on. But the 6 feet is really the rule of thumb that we try to strive for. This is important, no more than 50 individuals gathered in a common area. So that doesn't mean 50 individuals in a school building, that means 50 people in a room like this, or in the cafeteria, in the gym. That 50 individuals would require the social distancing as well as masks.
And this presents a number of challenges for us as a school department, of course. So when, in this particular cafeteria, when it's in session, there could be a couple hundred kids in here, or 150 kids in here, typically eating lunch. And so when you can't feasibly do that, and you have to be 6 feet apart, it slows your point of service, your getting of food, you're sitting, you're clearing of food, you're maintaining social distancing, the pickup, the transition, everything becomes a little slower because you have to maintain these distances, and you can only have so many students in a room at one time. And so when we start thinking about, again, that capacity threshold, we can't fill our buildings with students because we then can't adequately feed them and provide the nutrition they need, and so many other barriers, but I wanted to point that out. This room tonight is set up for just under 50 people in case someone needs to come from the room next door for overflow to speak at the mic. So we have to think about those little nuances and details as we're planning school days.
And the last bullet under social distancing just talks about staggered passing and other distancing protocols in place for hallways and the playground. So as we look at school schedules, we would need to be thinking about, especially at the middle school and high school, we can't just ring the bell and let every kid go out into the hallway. We're going to need to be strategic about how many students are in the hallway, which classrooms are letting out when. Are we able to make that happen? And building administration is already working on some possibilities for that to happen. Were there any questions before I move on? Yeah.
You mentioned that we're talking about trying to be consistent with Auburn and Oak Hill. I'm wondering what kind of commitments that produces from our district.
Well, I think consistent is a word I would use cautiously. I think we have coordinated with and tried to be as close as we can for a number of purposes. One of them, and we'll talk about later, like a hybrid model. We have to be consistent with our schedule because students come to LRTC from 6 different districts, Lewiston included. So there's 5 other school communities that send their kids here. Well, to do that and have programming, even with distancing, we have to have some level of coordination because otherwise it just won't work. And so we've been having those conversations all the way back into, I would say, at least for me with other principals, May and early June. And then that kind of trickled its way upward. And I know superintendents are talking about it as a region. This Wednesday afternoon, we have a meeting where we're meeting all together. So consistency, I'd say, is a cautious word. But I'm glad you brought that up because we can't force our plan or the collaborative thinking of others on all of the districts in the region, but that conversation is absolutely ongoing.
So would it be fair to say that the school committee is not bound to follow anything from any other district? That if other districts are taking steps that we think are ill-advised, that we have the option to go in a different direction,
So
pretty much regardless?
Yeah, the charge that I understand from the State of Maine Department of Education is we are bound by some things like the common calendar for those things like an RTC program.
Right.
And I would honor that law and that commitment as much as we can. But yes, to the effect that we could hear from our community and it could be decided by school committee members that we appreciate you taking the time to build this plan, we understand the constraints, it's not the direction we want to go. That is possible within the region.
Okay.
Maybe you'll go over this in a minute, but would we have the option to say that out of city kids that go to LRTC wouldn't be allowed to do that during this COVID period, unless there was like an IEP or something that mandated they had to?
So we asked this question, and the answer that we got from the Department of Education is that the statute remains unchanged, and the expectation as a region, which requires a common calendar and access to LRTC and its variable resources, and which is also tied to subsidy to a great extent, things that. But I'll say this, and I don't want to get into the weeds, but we did ask questions like, if school X, not Lewiston, decides to close because they have a hot spot, then what happens? Does the whole region close? Does just that one school close? And so it was not clear what the determination of the Department of Education was, other than to shift it back to what would be local control. So I do think we have some leeway, for sure, but I still think the statutes for that common component is a hinge that we want to be mindful of.
So when it comes to LRTC, we may not have the option to exclude students from non-Lewiston or students from a particular district, but if we had to, we could just say, it's not safe to open LRTC, or remote and LRT, or remote district-wide. And if that was the only option to deal with a hotspot in one of the contributing communities, that would remain an option for us.
Yeah, I think it has to, but I would almost treat it, and I don't want to oversimplify and ignore a lot of other detail that we could probably dive into. I'd assimilate it to a snow day. So if Lewiston canceled school, because we had a snowstorm here, let's say Poland and Levitt did not,
Yeah.
or vice versa, we kind of work that out as a forced upon cancellation, and we find ways for that to work. But we've never systematically planned for, this is not an available option for our region. The state, to me, at least in conversation, was very clear that I don't think they want us planning for that contingency because of law and the commitment to continue to provide educational opportunities as a region.
This is just a point of clarification. Are all the students from all the districts that have access to LRTC in English-Garden County, or no?
Yes, we are a region.
Okay, so we're not going to have to worry about any crossing the county borders.
We, in this particular region, do not. There are schools that do. That came up. The answer was local control.
Right.
So some additional things that impact the planning and the decision-making based on the framework. There are some hand washing and other measures that need to be taught, folks that need to be trained, a schedule for hand washing and other safety measures in school, as well as the training of that, the availability of hand sanitizer and enhanced cleaning protocols, the home symptom screening, and this is a shift from some guidance that came out the beginning of, I would say, June, even into the end of beginning of July. The screening process is not on the school system. There is a home screener that we are obligated to translate and provide to families and help educate families on, but it's not something we are required to do. So as a school system, we are not required to stand out front and screen students before they come in. We are required to set up hand washing stations and have sanitizer available and so on and so forth. But right now, according to the guidelines, that screening is not a responsibility of the district.
And I would say that that's caused great concern amongst our teachers who have contributed to this conversation, who have said, we've got some kids that, again, for various reasons, show up for school unprepared or because of the barriers and challenges that they have before them to get to school on time. Now we're saying that those very same folks will screen their children looking at, like, is it 12 indicator points or something to that effect to make sure that you don't have multiple, and if you do, you should stay home. And so if parents aren't self-screening their own children or guardians, and children aren't self-screening for whatever reason, there's again a big concern from teachers of what is that threshold of predictability for safety if we don't have that assurance. So that's another challenge.
In terms of symptoms and cases at school, of course, this is a question that we still need some additional clarification on, but of course our nurses will play a central role in helping us with this, and Bobby, Jake, and I met this morning with our nurses, and they've been part of our conversations at our school level to talk about that. Isolation areas will need to be identified within a building, and there are several protocols that need to be in place if a case is suspected for a staff member or for a student.
And little things as you transition slides, whatever that isolation area is, because you might have students who are sick, whether it's COVID or other, really it's about facilitating them getting home so they can have some care. That can be a challenge at times. We have parents who work. We have contact information that we need to improve on accuracy. So we don't always get someone. So a nurse could come across a student who needs to go home or be seen by somebody else and not be able to get a hold of a parent or coordinate a ride until later in the day. So we're trying to figure out some options there. But it's also recommended that any isolation area have access to, it may seem simple, but water and a bathroom. And so when we look at our schools and our school setup, I'll take LHS for example. The nurse's office is right in the main lobby or just off the main lobby. The closest available bathroom is within her office. You can't maintain 6 feet of distancing in her office with 2 people in there, never mind several. And so we have to come up with a plan for that. But the next immediate space for a bathroom facility is the main lobby bathroom, which is used by all the buildings. And then the next available classroom space is, again, going up into the B wing and then choosing a classroom there. You're looking for the very closest. And so we have these challenges. That's just one school, and we have to start working those out.
Yeah, I understand that we're not required to do screening in school. Does that mean that the district is recommending that we not do screening in school?
So that's a challenging one because I think the opinions will differ, probably even amongst our own leadership team, and I think that's a good thing. But I think when we look at language around the feasibility, I think it becomes very challenging to do it and to track it and to do it with efficacy. And, I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying logistically, with so many people showing up to a school building at one time, to maintain distancing, to do a screening check with every kid walking in the door, you could just start lunches after and then send them home because it would just take an exorbitant amount of time. And then the tracking question is another one. So.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that if we can't do screenings, and frankly, home screenings are a joke, that if we can't do it logistically, then it's not safe to send kids to school logistically. You know, I mean, that's how it strikes me.
So based on the guidelines, and the slides you saw previously were definitely a very quick snapshot of those guidelines. I mean, this is the packet of guidelines, and it changes almost daily. I think I print a new one every other day when the date changes, and so does everybody else. So based on those guidelines, this is the hybrid model that also includes a remote option that we have come up with. And for anybody who has been who was part of the task force that we had for several weeks, you've seen different versions of this. What this shows is there are 2 cohorts of students who would come to school in person 2 days a week and have a remote option the other 3 days. There's a 3rd cohort that would have the ability to be completely remote. And there's a 4th cohort that would allow for students to be in person 4 days a week. And that cohort would include some of our special purpose programs like our RISE and our functional life skills, as well as potentially our ELL newcomer programs, and also LRTC students would come 4 days a week, and thinking about a schedule that would allow for those students to do their hands-on work would allow for that. It would also, Jake, you say this better than I, but it also would allow for minimal back and forth between their home school and LHS, because they would be at LHS for four days in a row with that remote day in between. Do you want to add anything?
I mean, I guess I would just say that it might help limit the disruption to students and their learning, but also each school has to then plan for that other block of the students a day. And so the statute includes 350 hours of programming. And so if we maintain that 350 hours of programming, that Cohort D would need each of the hours of the day that we're in session to achieve that. I just want to reiterate for people, I know it says designation of yellow on this slide, but for us, because of the size of our school, because that is the state language, for us, the size of our school department, that is yellow and green, that it would be remote. And this would represent only 1 week on time. And so the first time I looked at this, I was very confused, so I tried to reiterate for people, because Karen had to explain it to me. But so as you see the days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, again, Cohort C would be this parent choice. And we've heard from a number of parents, but we don't know exactly how many, which is another barrier to our thinking. There's data points that we really feel like we need that we don't have enough of. And trust me, we've got surveys out there, we have more coming. We've taken the time to put in the effort. But if you're the same parent who doesn't have internet, who's not getting that email, or your contact information is inaccurate, you may be unaware that we're even looking for this information as a decision for you as a family. And again, we don't know how many teachers, because of a hybrid model, might have a disruption in their own life because their children are not in school. And the CARES relief, the Family First piece, the FF, is it RCA, Robin, Relief CARES Act?
Yes.
Like, isn't that right? Bobby schooled me up on a lot of things in this, but there's language in there that talks about if you have a child care disruption because of COVID-19, that you can actually file for what is like FMLA and be protected by that, which makes sense if you think about it, because where are the kids going to be if you're at work? And so I've told a personal story, I know other people have told theirs, but we have staff in our district that have children that are too young to be home alone that would otherwise be in school. And so if they can't do both, because they can't, what happens? Do we have the staffing capacity to run a model like this? We don't have that answer yet. Our HR department has worked hard to talk to people through survey results to find out what their obstacle is, but this is the first time people are hearing about this way of doing school. So it's going to generate another round of input.
So I think just jumping ahead, extrapolating from that is there's the equity issues that already exist in this district are going to be further exacerbated by this. And I mean, this may seem opportunistic, but we might have to reassign staff to buildings where everyone's home to accommodate. Is that something that is allowed in the contracts, temporary reassignment? I mean, not that I want that to be the situation, but it's a reality.
I think it's allowable, but
Okay.
I think we want to be smart about how we do it and considerate about what we're asking people to do to make sure they're qualified, certified, and all of those kinds of things for whatever they're being asked to do. But I also think part of the language in the CBA is that folks would need to know as soon as possible. And while we're still waiting for guidance from the state that we're hoping comes by this Friday, and last week's guidance that was supposed to come by Friday came late in the afternoon. A lot of people had already gone home. And so it's still this, so possible. But I would also want to sit with Ms. Litton from the LEA to say, okay, this is what we think we have. What's the best way to navigate this as a team? I will say we've had a lot of teachers step up and say, I'm willing to help problem solve any way I can. So we just got to strike that balance, because we can't just uproot someone because we decided to and not give them some forenotice and make sure that it's the right fit for them. And a bad example would be like high school. If you teach biology, that's a specific life science certification. To just move them to do something different would be a real challenge. It would be out of their certification and expertise.
So we will talk a little bit more about some additional ways we're hoping to find out some of this information from families, and it doesn't just involve doing things online, surveys online. I'll let Sue Williams speak to that in a few minutes. I also want to just say that it's important to know that we're working hard with transportation to figure out a way that students in Cohort A are all from the same families. So if your kindergartner comes to school on Monday and Tuesday, then your 7th grader would come to school on Monday and Tuesday, and your 9th grader would come to school on Monday and Tuesday. It sounds really easy for me to just say that. It's not, but it's something we're trying to work out, because we recognize that that would be impossible for a family to navigate. Well, which kid goes to school on Monday and Tuesday, so on and so forth. So we're working hard on that. As I said, transportation is a big factor in that. I also wanted to say that, I lost my train of thought. I don't know what my other thing, I don't remember what my other thing was. It'll come to me, I'm sure. So here's some more details, and I think this goes into some of the other pieces. So we would be asking families to commit to their preferred model for a period of time, so for a trimester or for a quarter. So there wouldn't be, unless there were extreme situations, so it wouldn't be allowed for a family to say, I'm going to start the year coming 2 days a week and having that hybrid model, and then the next week decide that they are going completely remote, and then making another choice the next week. We would ask families to commit to which model that they would be most interested in if we were doing hybrid and the remote learning options. That way it can be consistent for students, but also for staff. It will be very difficult to manage the back and forth if that wasn't there. Again, the hybrid instructional model, which involves Cohort A and B, I think we addressed this. The last bullet, a shortened school day to allow for teacher planning, PD collaboration, family check-in. So a student's schedule would resemble something like an early release day on Monday and Tuesday, or Thursday and Friday. We are able to do that based on the number of hours students have to be in school for it to be considered a student day. That also allows for teachers to connect with those students that are at home. So the students that are in Cohort B and they're home on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, that early release of sending students home would allow for teachers to check in with those students that are home. It would allow also for teachers to do the additional planning that it will require to have sort of managing those two platforms, right? The online and the in-person. The complete remote model, I remember what I was going to say, and I was looking at you because you have asked about the survey data from the spring. And we have a great presentation of that. So if we had had longer, I would have gone through that for you. But I do want to say that survey data that we got from parents from students and from staff played a huge part in our planning. Of course, like any survey, you're going to get both sides of the spectrum and some people in between in terms of what their experience was. We know that some of the things that we chose to do in the spring were not the best fit for all of our students. That is reflected in our models. So for example, I know our special ed population was a huge concern. Cohort D hopefully will help us address some of those concerns. We had families and students who said, yeah, remote learning worked really well for me. I prefer that it worked well. So there's an option there if we were to go with this model for that to happen as well. The other thing we know was a challenge, both for staff and for some families in terms of that attendance and that accountability, and the law or the guidance. There's no choice. We have to have some accountability. We have to have some sort of way of taking attendance for that to be considered a day in school for students. We also had some questions and some comments on the survey about some common expectations and some common platforms to be used across schools and across grade levels. And we've made some decisions as we move forward, regardless of which model we're in, that we will be using a consistent platform. So those of you who have heard me talk about this in the task force meetings, Google Classroom and Seesaw are both platforms that will allow for some interaction between a teacher and a student, and they'll be consistent across our schools and across our grade levels. And those can be used both in a remote model as well as a hybrid model, or if we're ever able to all come back together in full force. Benefits and challenges of hybrid learning. So this is specific to the hybrid model, which is probably the most challenging for people to wrap their heads around. It allows us to have some regular face-to-face instruction with our students and build those relationships. It helps provide for smaller classes, and not just for safety reasons, but hopefully with the smaller classes, we'll be able to meet the needs of those students, even though it would only be 2 days in person. It allows for some flexibility and readiness for remote learning. So if we were to ever go, we're going with this hybrid model, and then every 2 weeks when the CDC tells us where we're at, if we're at a place where we can no longer be in person, we would have the ability to go remote much more quickly than maybe we did in the spring. Of course, the challenges include the daycare challenges and supervision of children, as Jay talked about. Staffing challenges, definitely with a schedule like this. Transportation. Again, transportation is working hard to help us figure out what's doable and what's not. But the availability of drivers could put a whole different spin on this. Right now, Hudson is down 10 drivers. So that could swing us one way or the other. Devices, having devices available for students, and there are some challenges around that. Still working on getting devices back from students from the spring. Internet connectivity, working diligently on making sure we have correct information on that. That gets better every day. And monitoring student engagement as well as staff experience and preparation.
So I want to chime in onto some of the challenges. I think most of the people in this room know me, and I don't know any other way to do this than to just say it, so I'm going to say it. As we look at the hybrid model and we consider people and the challenges it presents to travel, nutrition, family, childcare, employee availability, buses, bus limitations, who's going to drive that bus? How many bus drivers we're short? I'm looking at a puzzle that we might be able to put together but it's gonna be pretty risky. And all of that doesn't weigh into the account of listen, I'm not a scientist, but I know the science hasn't changed. The thing that put us out of school in March is the very same thing that's challenging us today. And while Maine may be doing really well in the statistics, I don't want to risk people. I just don't. And so we are faced with this real conundrum of the fact that there's a lot of society right now that has, I'll call it COVID fatigue, probably the wrong term, who's saying, let's get back to work, let's go do these things, let's get things rolling. And so when we look at the DOE requirements, we built a plan that is probably feasible. But I can tell you right now, it's going to be a reflect, refine, respond, constant rotation this fall, if we can pull it off with staff, transportation, nutrition, you name it. We talked about one-to-one devices. Leading our IT department over here, Mr. Terrio, who has worked all hours of the day and night to try to get devices to Lewiston, Maine to make this happen. And everywhere he goes, he gets, yes, we'll take your order, but you may not get it right away. It's not Amazon 2-day shipping for this kind of order. It takes a long time to get these materials. And he's done his very best. And again, I thank him for his efforts. But the reality of supply and demand right now is huge. And so I don't want to sit here and have you thinking that we built this hybrid plan because we know that day one we can do this and it's going to go really well. We're saying that we built this plan because the guidelines say we need to have one. And is it feasible and possible in our district? Maybe. But it's not going to be real clean. It will require us to take certain risks, and it would require us to be considerate of some significant changes and adaptations along the way because of what we currently don't know for data points.
Okay. For Karen, what are we going to be using for materials, programs as far as remote learning? Are we doing the Edgenuity, or what's that is the plan?
Well, so I'm shaking my head. I'm not saying yeah. I'm not answering each question with yes. We have, so using a virtual platform to house our teaching and learning like Google Classroom and Seesaw is something that we're dedicated to doing. Edgenuity, so courseware, Pathblazer, and MyPath will definitely be part of what we're doing, but it will not be the instruction. The high school has done a ton of work with the courses that are available with Edgenuity to make them match and fit the courses that we teach at Lewiston High School. So there might be. I'm gonna pick a number. Let's say there are 7 modules that fit with Algebra 1. Now don't quote me on that. I'm just making that up. Those would be available and be part of the work that students would be required to do in those remote days, but it's the teacher's responsibility to do the teaching, and the continuous work happens in that platform. At the middle school and at the elementary level, those programs, MyPath and Pathblazer, are not intended to be the only instruction students get. They're intended to be an intervention. They're intended to be part of a blended model. So will they be available? Yes. Will students be able to use those and teachers be able to assign things? Yes, but it's still it's the responsibility of the district and of our staff to be doing the teaching and learning, the teaching and checking in on the learning. We also have, at the elementary level, we use the reading and writing units of study through the Teachers College. It's something we've used for quite some time now. And they have some videos that they're putting out that will assist our teachers in providing some direct instruction as a resource, but it's not to replace our teachers. It's to enhance the work and as a tool for them. So yes, there are pieces of Edgenuity and courseware and things that folks experienced in the spring, but they'll be used in a very different way. And so based on the feedback in the survey, we know that didn't work for a lot of folks, almost all of our folks. And now that we've had time to really look at that and use it in the way that I believe it's intended to be used, I think we can use it much more efficiently.
So the children who are going to be doing complete remote, will they have consistency just throughout the grade levels as far as what type of platform they'll be using?
Yes, so regardless of whether a student comes in cohort A or B or is in C or D, the expectation is, and this isn't just a Lewiston Public School expectation, it's a state expectation, that they continue to follow, they get instruction within the scope and sequence of our main learning results, that the work is appropriate to their developmental level and where they're at, just like it would be if they were in person. And that they are getting, it has to be daily contact with a staff person with some live instruction and feedback. So it will look different if they're completely remote, but there will be a teacher that will be working with them and providing that instruction.
Are there any accommodations available on Ingenuity or similar programs such as extended time, complete assignments, text-to-speech, written response questions, or is any of that stuff kind of built into these various programs?
Absolutely. So with Seesaw and with Google Classroom, there are the ability for students to have all of those accommodations, and those two platforms were chosen because of that. And just like, and there, so when I talk about Google Classroom and Edgenuity, Google Classroom and Seesaw, those aren't programs like Edgenuity. They're not a curriculum. They're it's sort of like when you use Gmail or you use another suite of apps. You can customize them, you can make them work for you. That's what Seesaw and Google Classroom allow. It allows the teacher to set that up and put out assignments and provide feedback. So just like if they were in the classroom, those accommodations would still need to be provided, especially for our students who have an IEP or our students who are, have other accommodations because of a 504, or they might be our ELL students who need those options, or any other student that would get those.
Just for the sake of saying it aloud, and I don't know if you have a reaction, but based on work that I do at the state level, I mean, we as Lewiston Public Schools, as Lewiston and Auburn even, are very different districts than, say, a community school up north somewhere, or some more rural challenge of a school. And so it's fascinating to see the state try to set the guideline and then work its way, like trickle down from there. And so I think as much as we can exercise local control, we should. And so if you can kind of, at least for me, cue when that is helpful, because the state is not going to line up with what we need here in Lewiston. They're not thinking about what's best for Lewiston. We all are, right? And so I just want to voice that at the very least.
No, I agree with you, and I think that red, green, and yellow gets to that a little bit because they know that there are different needs in terms of COVID. But I think it's also important to go back to what Jake said about the little school in northern Maine may be able to meet those guidelines and go green. And I know that there are schools that are doing that. They're bringing all of their kids back, and they're using the gym as a classroom, and they're using the cafeteria as a classroom, and they're able to do that with all the kids in the building. That's not feasible for us. So the state is saying, if you can meet these guidelines and you're in green, then you can do it. They're also saying if you're in yellow and you can meet these guidelines to do some sort of hybrid model, then you can do it, if the school committee says that's what they want to do. And then the other option is always you do a complete remote model, if that's what they. So we don't have to submit a plan to the state. It's decided on by us, you, as a group, and then in what's best for our district. As long as we can say we can meet these guidelines.
So I just have a really quick question. During the discussions about the cohorts, and we talked about how big those cohorts are going to be, because I know for people in my neighborhood, there's a lot of pressure to get back to work right now, which may lead them to make decisions like put their kids in cohort D, even though it's maybe not the best for their kid or themselves or the school district. Are we going to have any sort of guidelines on how many kids can be in a cohort? Because that's pushing a lot of people to go back to work right now is the fact that if I don't work, I can't feed my kids.
Yeah. So the Cohort D is really about special populations, so those kind of identify themselves because of students who are in programs. And that varies from TC in the trades all the way down or to students who are in like functional life skills programs where remote learning is not even realistic. And so the other way the cohorts would be broken up, and Karen explained a little bit, but just try to figure out which families so that the whole group of students that might reside in one place go to school together. That might alleviate some pressures on the home. But then, so cohort A, B would really just be the best we can for a rational split in the remaining student body. And a big part of this conversation that, again, we just don't know yet is how many people are going to choose to be in cohort C. Because if that is a really big number, we have to manage that to provide education. If that is a really small number, we have to manage that because we'll have more people in the building, and we still have that staffing levels concern. But I hope that helps answer your question. I don't know if you want to add to that, Karen?
Oh, that's what I was, so it's essentially taking a classroom and saying half the class will be there on Monday and Tuesday, and half the class will be there Thursday and Friday. That's a really easy way to explain it. It's much more complicated than that, but the cohort D would be not something that a family could choose. That would be something that we would select for a certain population. So I think that's important to put out there. We'd love to be able to offer that to more families, but the number of people we can have in the space. Transportation is another one. Many of our students who are in terms of our special ed programming, their transportation is different than, there might be a van or there might be a smaller vehicle that brings them to school rather than a large school bus. So we have a little bit more flexibility with that. I'm looking at the time, and I just want to get through the last couple slides here. We've talked a little bit about adjusting our calendar for any of you who've been part of those conversations with the task force. This is something, again, that we have to rely on the state and our region to allow for us to make an adjustment in terms of being common. We do have a draft, and it's something that we're hoping within the next, hopefully by the next school committee meeting, we can bring to you for a potential decision. But if allowed, we'd like to adjust our start date for students to the 31st or the 1st to allow for 5 days of professional development for our staff prior to the start of school. That does not add any additional student days, and it does not add any additional staff days. We reworked the calendar, so we pulled out some staff days from the middle of the year to put them at the beginning of the year. Again, some additional guidance from the state may come that says we have more flexibility with those days. If it does, then we have a little bit more freedom. If it doesn't, then we have a way to cover those days if allowed. Definitely would involve the safety and hygiene training, as well as how to work in a hybrid or remote model for our staff. Some of that professional learning has already been put out there to staff, and I just want to give a shout out to our staff that they have been amazing at getting involved in that and being willing to participate on their own time. It's not mandatory, it's an option, but they've been willing to do that. There's a whole website that has all of that information, and some additional PD around those platforms are needed.
And Karen, as you switch slides, we have floated those dates to the region, and they're amenable to those. It's a little shift. It's about getting people. It's kind of going slow so we can go fast. Get people trained, prepared, have time to do the work they need to do to have their classes ready, regardless of the model. And then when we do have kids either in front of us or remote, we can move. So that's the intent of those days. And I know that there's been discussions about the state as to whether or not they'll waive the number of student days this year. There's a rumor that they may, but it has not been announced or shared yet. And we can't deviate too much from it without that. But I have heard things as much as, even recently as this afternoon, of districts saying, we're actually going to start with kids until the second week of September, so that they have 3 or more weeks of prep time with their teachers to get this ready to roll out. So just as food for thought, is because as we approach our next school committee meeting, which is scheduled for the 10th of August, it's going to be a break point. We're going to have this input cycle done and make some pretty significant decisions for our district.
So in terms of that input, well, first I'll say we want to also plan for and allow for families to learn about those plans, as well as come and get oriented to what it is that we expect. So that looks like a couple different things. There are some family and staff forums that will be happening this week. There will also be the larger document that you all received in your packet, that this is a snapshot of on our website. It's already translated. There's a form for families to respond. Very simple, and that's already been translated and it's ready to go, so that should be put up soon. We also have those forums that we're going to do virtually, both with staff and with the public, and those will be on Thursday, so more information to come. Jake will be sending out the link and some additional communication. Thinking about the beginning of school and being creative about how we educate our families. And I don't have the answer to this, but are there ways to set tents up outside and have families come and sit with someone at a safe distance to learn about what the expectation of the online platforms look like? Or going to our neighborhoods and into our community to do some of that work as well. Talking Points is a communication tool that will allow for us to send out information in a variety of languages very quickly. So this is something we're looking at. We used through the closure in the spring. It's part of our CARES plan and using some of those funds. The social emotional learning and mental health and well-being, we want to just highlight that this is, even though these other details are important, that is probably one of the most important details that we're thinking about in terms of providing support both for students and staff and families. And there's a whole group that's really working on what that's going to look like. Our next steps, we've already talked about this, we'll continue to meet. We want feedback, these conversations, any feedback the public provides for us, teachers and other staff. There are those forums that we talked about. More information to come on those. We'll get that out as soon as we're have those links. August 3rd is not necessarily the date that has to happen. We just put a date there, we put a placeholder there for a final approval after we get guidance from the state. And then the parent preference survey would be to allow for our families to provide us with which model they would like. And Sue, do you have anything to add about that preference survey? No? Okay. So that's already being worked out. That's something that's being translated, and we have some plans, again, to do that in a variety of ways, not just click the link and fill it out, but allow for families to use the language line, allow for families to have the ability to fill that survey out in person, whether it's at our food sites that we have or some of our local places where we know some of our families are at. So we've been thinking about ways to get that message out that's different than just our traditional ways of doing that. Tanya.
So with the size of this district, do you think that the 5 extra days of professional development for the teachers is enough? Have you heard anything from the teachers as far as they think it might need more than that to be successful?
I think they would say they could always use more. I know one of the things that we talked a lot about, or I talked a lot about with Allison and even with our teacher advisory group, they were grateful that we were thinking about doing that ahead of time rather than just trying to use those 2 days that we already had in the calendar. With the guidelines right now, we were stuck with sticking to the number of days that teachers have to work and students need to be in session, be in class. They would like some additional days throughout the year to continue that professional development, so if that's a possibility. The Wednesdays, so you saw that the Wednesdays were complete remote, and the schedule would allow for us to do some additional PD on those days, as well as give teachers choice about what they wanted additional PD on, because we were getting really good at being able to offer some virtual PD that maybe we hadn't done in the past. So the answer is yes, they would like more, but.
And I think, because if we go this route, the nature of the reflect, refine, and fix and get better, I think people will need days intermittently to do that work. And so the way in which we secured those days was to grab them from other places in the year. I guess I would look up, if we have the flexibility from the state, to ask all of you, could we put in a day or two every some kind of staggered thing, so that we have these break points that happen in the year where there's natural transitions. Teachers are going to need some lead time to be prepared for that. And so I think that those would be the things that we'd be looking for down the road, if we have the flexibility.
As far as non-English speakers, has it been put out there to maybe videotape an actual interpreter going through the forms, or even going through Google Classroom or whatever programs that can be used, so parents just have a visual? I think that's also a big problem. Parents get this and have no idea what to do, and are relying on the kid to show them. Where if we get somebody who's actually, can interpret, they can kind of show them, and then also have a visual of how you do this.
Yes, definitely something we've thought about in terms of a video, but we also would like to be able to bring a live, we'd like to be able to offer live and in person too, so that you can do some hands-on, of course, safely. But yes, definitely been considered, and we do have the capability of doing that with the video, and even creating the video and then interpreting over it. So definitely has been considered, but that's part of those, how do we orient those families and what's the best way to do it? And even get them the information, allow them to give us information and feedback.
So I guess anything I could say, just to close out, first off, Karen, thank you very much for all of your time. If there's any other questions, certainly we'll entertain them, but I want to emphasize to anybody listening, watching, Thursday afternoon we're going to have a couple of teacher groups, and then Thursday evening from 6 to 7:30 we have the community forum. We're going to use Lexicate for that, so we can support all the different languages. They know our information up front, so they can relay that to community members, and it also allows people to provide questions either themselves through typing in a question or provide input, or through the interpreter. So we're going to include people in this feedback. This next 7 days or so of feedback, to me, is critical to inform whatever our next step might be, up to and including you having what you need to make a decision on how we're going to open school and what that's going to look like for us.
Does anyone need a quick break before we jump into our regular business meeting? Yes, okay, we'll take 5 minutes.